On the Road to Revolution by Anne Rossi. Setting the scene, the American colonies in 1763. From 1756 to 1763, all the great powers of Europe were engaged in the 7 Years' War. France, Austria, Great Britain, Russia, and many other countries battled over land in Europe and over their colonies. The part of this war that was fought in North America came to be known in the United States as the French and Indian War. When the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, and the French and Indian War with it, Great Britain had won most of France's North American territories. Great Britain was now one of the most powerful countries in the world, and many American colonists were pleased to be part of this powerful empire. However, tensions between Great Britain and its colonies would soon develop. With the war over, King George III of Great Britain began to take an active interest in his now much larger colonies in the Americas. Unfortunately for King George, new ideas were becoming popular in the 1700s, ideas that would make it difficult for him to control his colonies. The term natural rights was beginning to be used in political debates and in writing. People began discussing the rights of the individual. Among the many rights they discussed were the rights to be free, to own property, and to participate in government. People in the 13 colonies had come to enjoy rights and freedoms that people in Europe only discussed. When new laws were passed, many colonists felt that the British government was interfering with their rights and freedoms. Sowing the seeds of conflict. The 7 Years' War had left Great Britain with huge debts, so some of the growing interest in the colonies was interest in colonial money. Many British leaders felt that Britain's American colonies should help pay the war debts. After all, were the colonists not loyal subjects of the king? Had they not benefited from having the French defeated? In 1764, the British government enacted the first in a series of tax laws that they hoped would increase revenues, or money coming in, from the American colonies. The Revenue Act of 1764, also called the Sugar Act, set taxes on sugar and molasses from non-British ports. In addition to raising revenue, this act was designed to stop colonists from buying sugar from French and Dutch traders. The taxes angered many colonists who wanted to buy less expensive sugar, even if they were buying from Great Britain's enemies. The following year, the British passed the Stamp Act, which required colonists to pay a tax on documents, newspapers, and other materials printed in the colonies. The colonists were outraged, and many refused to pay. Representatives from 9 colonies met in New York to protest the Stamp Act. They pointed out that colonists were British subjects, and that one of their rights was that only their elected representatives could tax them. Because they had no representatives in Parliament, the colonists argued, Parliament should not tax them. They accused Parliament of tyranny, the cruel or unfair use of power. The slogan, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," became popular. Colonists were not buying British goods, which hurt British merchants. Also, Parliament realized that it was unlikely that it would ever collect much revenue from this tax, so the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. The same year in which the Stamp Act was passed, 1765, Parliament passed the Quartering Act. This law required colonists to care for British soldiers stationed in the American colonies. British lawmakers felt that colonists should help pay for the soldiers who were protecting the colonies. Colonists were responsible for providing food, drink, housing, coal or firewood, and candles to troops stationed in their towns. Many colonists obeyed the Quartering Act, but because many resented it, they often provided fewer supplies than the soldiers needed. The colony of New York had to support the largest number of soldiers, so tensions were greatest there. When the New York Assembly refused at first to assist with quartering British troops, a fight occurred and a colonist was wounded. At the same time Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, it issued the Declaratory Act. This act stated that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies for any reason. It was not until the next year that colonists learned what would be taxed next. In 1767, Britain passed the Townshend Acts. One of these laws prohibited the New York Assembly from conducting business until it met the requirements of the Quartering Act. Another law created tariffs on many imported goods. A third act established a system of customs or tax collection in the colonies and included a board of customs commissioners in Boston. In 1768, soldiers were sent to Boston to keep order and to enforce the Townshend Acts. Angry colonists organized boycotts of British goods, which hurt British merchants. On March 5, 1770, the British Parliament agreed to repeal some of the taxes. However, it did not repeal the tax on tea. That same day, an incident occurred in Boston that would dramatically increase anti-British feelings in the colonies. Violence erupts. Fistfights between soldiers and colonists were becoming fairly common in Boston. On March 5, 1770, however, a much more serious incident occurred. According to some reports, a threatening crowd had surrounded a group of British soldiers outside the custom house. The crowd rapidly grew in size, taunting the soldiers and hurling objects at them. The commanding officer told his soldiers to hold their fire. However, when a snowball hit a soldier, first one startled soldier and then another fired into the crowd. In the end, 3 people were killed and 8 more were wounded. 2 of the wounded later died. Patriots, or colonists who opposed British rule, called the incident the Boston Massacre. Newspaper accounts picked up the name, and soon many colonists were rallying in opposition to British policies in the colonies. Although the killing of 5 people could not be defined accurately as a massacre, the needless killing of a large number of people, it was a violent event that showed how strained relations between the colonists and the British had become. Like many colonists, Sam Adams thought the use of soldiers against civilians was a symbol of tyranny. He proclaimed that the Boston Massacre was a battle for American liberty. The British soldiers were put on trial. Lawyer John Adams, a cousin of Samuel Adams, and his assistant, Josiah Quincy, defended them. Adams argued that the crowd had provoked the soldiers, and therefore the soldiers were innocent of murder. 2 of the soldiers were later found guilty of manslaughter, which meant they hadn't planned to kill anyone. As was the custom in those days, the 2 guilty of manslaughter were branded on their thumbs as punishment. After the Boston Massacre, the British withdrew their troops to an island in Boston Harbor shortly after the Boston Massacre, thanks in part to the efforts of Samuel Adams. In 1772, Adams and other Boston leaders formed a committee of correspondence. Express riders delivered their correspondence or letters to other communities, keeping them informed of local events and how groups of patriots hoped to stop Great Britain's interference. This network of writers and riders helped unite the colonies. Samuel Adams also organized resistance to the Tea Act. The tax on tea still existed after the Townshend Acts had been repealed in 1770. After all, the British government needed to have some way of showing that it had the right to tax the colonies. However, the colonists had gotten around this tax by buying tea smuggled in by Dutch traders. In 1773, the British passed the Tea Act, a law that reduced taxes on tea and made it easier for the East India Company to sell tea to the colonies. It also stated that only agents of the East India Company could sell the tea to stores in the colonies. So independent shippers and traders in the colonies were going to lose business. The East India Company's tea would be able to compete with the smuggled tea because their prices would be the lowest available, even though the tea was still taxed. But the colonists did not like the idea of the British government taxing them, and despite the lower price, they would not buy the tea. Although tea was much loved in the colonies, merchants in New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and other cities canceled tea orders or refused shipments. However, the British-appointed governor in Boston wanted to obey the law. He insisted that 3 ships waiting in the harbor be allowed to unload their cargo of tea, and that they be paid for it. A group of patriots had other plans for the tea. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of about 60 men disguised themselves as Mohawks and boarded the ships. A larger crowd of Bostonians had come with them, and they watched from the docks as the smaller group dumped chest after chest of tea into the harbor. Colonists knew this was an important event, and some collected samples of tea as souvenirs. Heading toward revolution. Parliament passed several laws in 1774 to punish Bostonians and to show others what could happen if they defied British authority. Colonists called these the Intolerable Acts because they were intolerable or unbearable. The port of Boston was closed, unapproved town meetings were banned, and British soldiers returned. Samuel Adams sent letters throughout the colonies pointing out that Britain could interfere with other colonial governments just as it had in Massachusetts. From September 5th to October 26, 1774, representatives from every colony except Georgia gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They voted to cease trade with Britain until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. Most of the representatives were not in favor of independence, but they agreed to begin strengthening their militias. They also agreed to a second meeting in May 1775 if Britain had not changed its policies by then. In February 1775, Britain declared that Massachusetts was in open rebellion. 2 months later, General Gage, who now controlled Boston, received secret orders to arrest leaders of the rebellion, including Samuel Adams. The Patriot leaders learned of this and fled to Lexington. On April 18, 1775, Patriots in Boston learned that British soldiers were planning a nighttime march to Lexington to search for the Patriot leaders, and then to Concord to destroy Patriot supplies. They knew that the militia must be warned. At 11 p.m., Paul Revere galloped on horseback out of Boston to warn militias and leaders that the British were coming. William Dawes and Samuel Prescott joined him along the way. The 3 reached Lexington, but a British patrol stopped them as they left. Only Prescott escaped to reach Concord. However, the militia had been alerted by Prescott, and Minutemen were ready when the British arrived in Lexington. The next day, fighting began between British soldiers and American patriots in Lexington, Massachusetts. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War in America.